Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at another Rook Endgame, and this endgame is known as the Lucena Position. The Lucena Position was named after Luis Ramirez de Lucena, a Spanish chess player that lived in the 15th and 16th century. And although Lucena didn't actually study this endgame, he is credited with the name of it. So let's look at what you should do, and probably some other moves that both sides can play in an endgame like this. So if we assess the position, we can see that white is up a pawn, but it is kind of hard to promote his pawn since his king is blocking its pawn from promoting. So what white will do is white will play rook d1 check, and rook d1 check is trying to force the king off of the d file, and in particular the d8 square, because it needs to get away from defending the c8 and the c7 squares. And c8 and c7 are the two main squares that white can use to vacate his king so that his pawn will easily queen. So black will play king e7. King e8 also will work, but white will still use the same idea. And white plays rook to d4 here. And rook d4, although it doesn't look like it's doing much at the moment, really has a very hidden purpose. So black will play rook a1. He will just wait, see what white will do. And now white will bring his king out to c7. And of course, black cannot let it stay this way. He needs to start checking. Because if he doesn't check, then white will simply queen his pawn, and that'll basically be it. So black checks on c1. King to b6. Rook to b1 check. King c6. King a6 can also work. After rook a1 check, both of the positions kind of transpose. So after king b5, rook b1 check. And now white will play rook to b4. The main idea of rook d4. Now he's shielding his king and his pawn from the rook's attack. So now black has no other option but to trade, and after rook takes b4 check, king takes b4. After king d7, white will simply queen his pawn, and white is in a way better position. So, okay, that is one way to go, and this just shows you the main idea of how you can employ the Lucena position. But there are also some other moves and mistakes that players could make in a position like this. So instead of rook d4, you could imagine that white would play his king out to c7 immediately. And it looks like it's doing the same thing, but it really doesn't. After rook c2 check, king b6, rook b2 check, king a7, rook a2 check, king b8, yes, white is still winning, but you unnecessarily prolong the game for 3 more moves. So it would probably just be better to play rook d4 immediately. So instead of rook a1 in this position, black could also play something like rook b2, trying to maybe attack the pawn from the b file. But if black does this, he has simply given up control of the a file, and white will make advantage of it with rook to a4. And now he is trying to bring his king out to a square such as a7, even a8 will work. And once the king goes to those 2 squares, black is basically done for. King d7 would have to be played to try to stop the pawn from queening, but even king a8 or even king a7 can work. Both will be shown. If you play king to a8, then after king c7, rook c4 check, and after king d7, you'll queen, and then this is winning. Or after king to a7, king c7, you'll queen yet again, and after rook takes, rook c4 check, king d6, king takes b8. Instead of playing b8 queen immediately, you could also play rook c4. Both moves work. But the main idea is that rook b2 is not helping black whatsoever because it's giving white control of the a file. So that doesn't work. But what happens instead of rook c1, you play, I don't know, king e6. You know that if you keep checking the king, it'll lead you nowhere, so why not just make a casual move? Well, this loses to maybe 2 other ways. But first, let's cover a big mistake that white could do. We discussed that the Lucena position is all about building a bridge and making sure that your opponent's rook will not attack your king or your pawn. But if you do that in this position by playing rook to d5, then you've just gone from winning to drawn. Because black will now play rook takes b7, and now this is a drawn endgame because you would have to play something like rook d6 check, and after king e7, if you grab the rook, then black will grab the rook. Same thing, which will happen if after king takes b7 immediately, black will just take the rook, and this is an insufficient material draw. So, therefore, you cannot do that. So, white must play something like rook e4 check. And after rook e4 check, the king has two squares it can go to. f6 is not as helpful. So, it can go to f5, or it could go to f7. We'll cover both of those squares. If the king goes to, say, f7, then white will play rook e5, and now the rook takes b7 idea doesn't work, since there's no king attacking the rook. So that idea will work, and now the rook will come to b5, block the rook, and that's basically it. So what happens if king f5 is played? Well, if king f5 is played, which tries to block the idea of rook e5 check, then white will simply go from behind, rook e8. And now he is, of course, threatening to play b8 queen, so black needs to start resorting to checks, rook c1 check, king d6, and after rook d1 check, king e7, for example, rook e1 check, white will simply play king f7, and he's hidden behind the black king. So then black would have to play rook b1, and after white queens, black would have to give up the rook, and this would be winning for white. And finally, another way that you could win as white, you could play rook d6 check here. And rook d6 check is trying to move the king away from control of the d5 square. So after king e7, note that if king e5 is played, then you will simply play rook d8 and go back from behind. King e7 will be played, and now rook d5. And yet again, rook takes b7 will not work here, so you'd have to give check. After king b6, rook b1 check, rook b5, take on b5, you take on b5, king d7. Yet again, black cannot stop the pawn will queen, and black is lost. So, if you just understand the main idea that white needs to build a bridge along the 4th rank, and for black it's the 5th rank, then you're going to have no problems winning with the technique that the Lucena position has. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.